The wind carved through the empty parking lot behind Murphy's grocery like a blade, sharp and unforgiving. It rattled the windows of the beat-up Honda Civic parked beneath the single flickering streetlight, where Michael Hayes sat hunched over the steering wheel, his breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. 3:27 a.m. The dashboard clock glowed green in the darkness, marking another sleepless night in what had become their routine. Michael pulled his worn work jacket tighter around his shoulders and glanced back at the makeshift bed he'd constructed in the rear seat. Sophie lay curled beneath layers of blankets, her 8-year-old frame so small she barely took up half the space. Even in sleep, her breathing carried that slight wheeze that never quite went away, the sound that reminded him every moment why they were here. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a crumpled envelope, the same one he'd been counting and recounting for the past week. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. $17.38. That was all that remained after Sophie's last prescription. The medication that kept her lungs clear, her airways open, her small body fighting against the chronic illness that had already taken so much from them both. Michael's fingers traced the worn bills, calculating again what he already knew by heart. Sophie's next dose was due in 2 days. The prescription would cost $43. The math was simple and brutal. "Daddy?" Sophie's voice was soft, barely audible above the wind. "Are you cold?" He turned, forcing a smile he didn't feel. "Just checking the weather, sweetheart. Go back to sleep." But Sophie was already sitting up, her dark hair sticking up at odd angles, her eyes bright despite the hour. She had her mother's eyes, warm brown with flecks of gold that caught the light even in darkness. "I'm not really sleeping," she admitted, crawling forward to lean against the back of his seat. "I was thinking." "About what, baby?" "About how this is like camping, but better." She rested her chin on his shoulder. "Regular camping, you have to worry about bears and bugs and stuff. But in our car, we're safe. And we get to see all the stars." Michael looked up through the windshield at the vast expanse of sky, clear and cold and dotted with pinpricks of light. When had he stopped noticing them? When had survival become so consuming that he'd forgotten to look up? "They're beautiful," he whispered. "Mama used to say that stars were like little promises," Sophie said, her voice carrying that wisdom that sometimes surfaced in children who'd seen too much too early. That even when everything feels dark, there's still light somewhere. A lump formed in Michael's throat. He reached back and smoothed her hair, the gesture automatic and tender. "Your mama was a smart woman." "She was, and she'd be proud of us, right, for being brave?" "The bravest," he managed. A soft, scratching sound came from outside the car. Michael tensed, his protective instincts flaring, but Sophie peered out the window with curiosity rather than fear. "Look, Daddy, he's back." About 10 feet away, barely visible in the shadows beyond the streetlight's reach, sat a medium-sized dog. His coat was mottled brown and black, matted in places but not unkempt. The animal had been appearing sporadically over the past few weeks, always keeping his distance, always watching. Never approaching, but never truly leaving either. "He looks lonely," Sophie observed. "He's a stray sweetheart. Wild dogs can be dangerous." "But he doesn't look dangerous. He looks like he's just waiting." Michael studied the animal more carefully. There was something in the dog's posture, a patient alertness that spoke of intelligence rather than aggression. As if sensing their attention, the dog lifted his head slightly, ears pricked forward but made no move to approach. "Can we give him something to eat?" Sophie asked. Michael's hand instinctively moved to the small bag of groceries in the front seat, a loaf of day-old bread, a jar of peanut butter, and 3 apples. Their meals for the next 2 days, carefully rationed. "Maybe tomorrow," he said softly. Sophie nodded, understanding without needing explanation. She'd learned not to ask for things they couldn't afford. Learned to find joy in small moments. Learned to be grateful for their car camping adventures even when the cold seeped through the blankets and made her teeth chatter. "I love you, Daddy," she said, settling back into her nest of blankets. "I love you too, baby, more than all those stars put together." As Sophie's breathing gradually deepened into genuine sleep, Michael remained awake, watching the dog who watched them back. Tomorrow he would face the pharmacy. face Mrs. Patel's kind eyes and gentle questions. Tomorrow he would find a way to make $17.38 stretch far enough to keep his daughter breathing. Tonight, though, he sat vigil in the cold, counting stars and counting dollars and trying to believe that his wife had been right about promises hidden in the darkness. The bell above Patel's pharmacy chimed with the same gentle tone it had carried for the past 15 years, announcing Michael and Sophie's arrival into the warm, antiseptic-scented interior. Mrs. Patel looked up from behind the counter, her dark eyes crinkling at the corners as she smiled at Sophie, though Michael caught the subtle way her gaze lingered on his hollow cheeks and the way his jacket hung loose on his frame. "Good morning, Mr. Hayes. Sophie, dear, how are you feeling today?" Sophie bounced on her toes, a remarkable display of energy considering she'd spent the night in a car. "I'm good, Mrs. Patel. Daddy and I saw the most beautiful stars last night. And there was this dog." "A stray," Michael interrupted quickly, his voice rougher than intended. He cleared his throat and pulled the crumpled prescription from his pocket. "We need her refill, please." Mrs. Patel took the paper with practiced efficiency, but her movements were slower than usual, more deliberate. She'd been the town's pharmacist since before Sophie was born, had filled prescriptions for 3 generations of families. She'd learned to read more than just doctors' handwriting. She could read the spaces between words, the things people didn't say. "This will take just a few minutes," she said, disappearing into the back room where the medications were kept. Sophie wandered over to the small display of greeting cards near the front window, her fingers trailing along the bright colors and cheerful messages. Michael remained at the counter, shifting his weight from foot to foot, acutely aware of how his work boots squeaked against the clean linoleum floor. The pharmacy felt too warm after the bitter cold outside, but Michael didn't remove his jacket. The frayed cuffs and worn patches were too obvious, too revealing. He caught his reflection in the security mirror mounted in the corner and quickly looked away. When had his eyes become so sunken? When had his hair started showing so much gray? "Daddy, look at this one." Sophie held up a card decorated with cartoon puppies. "It says, 'Thank you for being awesome. Can we get it for Mrs. Patel? She's always so nice to us.'" Michael's chest tightened. The card cost $2.50. $2.50 that might be needed for gas or bread or the countless small necessities that added up to survival. "Maybe another time, sweetheart." Sophie's face fell slightly, but she nodded and carefully placed the card back in its slot. The gesture was so mature, so understanding, that it nearly broke Michael's heart. 8 years old, and she already knew the weight of "maybe another time." Mrs. Patel emerged from the back room carrying the small bottle that held Sophie's lifeline. "Here we are," she said, setting it on the counter. "That'll be $43. Michael reached for his wallet, his movements mechanical. $17.38. The envelope crinkled as he opened it, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet pharmacy. Mrs. Patel watched him count the bills twice, then a third time. Her expression remained neutral, professional, but her fingers drummed silently against the counter. "I'm sorry," Michael said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm a little short today. I can pay the rest on Friday when I get paid for the Henderson job." "Of course," Mrs. Patel said without hesitation. "Friday is fine." But Michael saw the concern that flickered across her features, the way she glanced at Sophie and then back at him. He saw the questions forming behind her kind eyes, and he couldn't bear to answer them. "Actually," she continued, reaching under the counter, "I have some samples here. The pharmaceutical company dropped them off last week." She produced an identical bottle, full of the same tablets. "These should tide you over until Friday." It was a lie, and they both knew it. Pharmaceutical samples didn't come in full prescription bottles with typed labels, but it was a gentle lie, offered with such grace that Michael could almost pretend it was true. "I couldn't." "Nonsense, they'll just go to waste otherwise." Mrs. Patel's tone brooked no argument. She handed him both bottles, the paid prescription and the sample, for Sophie. Michael's throat worked soundlessly. He managed a nod, unable to trust his voice. "Mrs. Patel," Sophie piped up, having drifted back to the counter, "do you like dogs?" "I do indeed, dear." "Why do you ask?" "There's this dog that visits us sometimes. He's really pretty, but he looks hungry. Daddy says he might be dangerous, but I think he just needs a friend." Mrs. Patel's gaze shifted to Michael, who stood frozen with the medications clutched in his hands. "Stray animals often just need someone to show them kindness," she said carefully. "They're usually more afraid of us than we are of them." "That's what I think too." Sophie beamed. "Maybe someday we can help him." "I'm sure you will, dear. You have a very kind heart." Michael finally found his voice. "Thank you," he said, the words inadequate for the magnitude of what she'd just done. "For everything." Mrs. Patel smiled, but her eyes remained serious. "Take care of yourself, Mr. Hayes, both of you." As they walked toward the door, Sophie skipping ahead, Michael felt Mrs. Patel's gaze following them. He knew she was putting pieces together, drawing conclusions he wasn't ready for anyone to reach. The warmth of her kindness warred with the cold shame of his need, leaving him feeling exposed and grateful and terrified all at once. The bell chimed again as they stepped back into the bitter morning air, carrying with them more than just medication. They carried the weight of being seen, of being known, of being cared for by someone who asked no questions but offered everything she could give. Behind them, Mrs. Patel remained at the window long after they disappeared from view, her weathered hands clasped together, her mind already turning toward the gentle conspiracy of kindness that small towns could weave around those too proud to ask for help. The temperature dropped another 10 degrees that weekend, turning the inside of the Honda into what felt like a metal icebox with wheels. Michael's breath came out in visible puffs as he adjusted the pile of blankets in the back seat, creating a nest warm enough for Sophie but leaving little room for himself. The driver's seat had become his bed, reclined as far back as it would go, his long legs cramped against the dashboard. "Tell me about the castle again, Daddy," Sophie said, her voice muffled by the layers of covers pulled up to her chin. Her eyes were bright in the darkness, reflecting the distant glow of the convenience store sign across the street. Michael settled into his makeshift bed, pulling his own thinner blanket around his shoulders. "Which castle, sweetheart?" "The one we're going to build. The one with the tower for me and the workshop for you." It was their game, their ritual that transformed the cramped car into something magical. Michael closed his eyes and let his imagination paint pictures in the cold air. "Well, your tower would be round, with windows all around so you can see in every direction. And there would be a spiral staircase with a banister you could slide down. And books everywhere, shelves and shelves of them. Of course, a whole library just for you, and my workshop would be right below so I could hear you reading aloud sometimes." "What would you build in your workshop?" Michael considered this, the same question she asked every time, as if testing whether his dreams had changed. I think I'd build toys. Wooden toys that would last forever. Rocking horses and dollhouses and music boxes. For kids whose parents can't afford the store-bought ones?" The wisdom in her 8-year-old voice never failed to surprise him. "Yes, baby, for kids just like you." A soft scratching sound interrupted their castle building, followed by the distinctive thump of something settling against the side of the car. Sophie sat up, peering out the fogged window. "He's back," she whispered, excitement evident in her voice. Through the condensation, Michael could make out the familiar silhouette of the stray dog, this time much closer than usual. The animal had positioned himself against Sophie's door, his body creating a barrier between the car and the empty lot beyond. "He's protecting us," Sophie breathed. Michael studied the dog more carefully. The animal's posture was alert but relaxed, head up, ears forward, but his body language spoke of watchfulness rather than aggression, as if he'd appointed himself their guardian for the night. "Maybe he's cold too," Sophie suggested. "Maybe he knows we understand what it's like." Before Michael could respond, headlights swept across the parking lot. A pickup truck pulled in near the dumpsters, its engine rumbling too loud for the quiet night. 2 men got out, their voices carrying across the cold air, rough with alcohol and bad intentions. The dog was on his feet instantly, a low growl rumbling from his chest. Not loud, but unmistakable. The men paused, spotting the animal, and Michael saw one of them point toward their car. "Someone's sleeping over there," the man said, his words slurred. "Probably got money." Michael's heart began to race. His hand moved instinctively to the door lock, though he knew it would offer little protection if the men decided to approach. Sophie had gone completely still beside him, sensing the tension even if she couldn't understand its source. The dog stepped forward, placing himself directly between the truck and their car. His growl deepened, and even from inside the Honda, Michael could see the ridge of hair standing up along the animal's back. The two men hesitated, clearly reconsidering their approach. The dog might not have been large, but there was something in his stance that suggested he would not back down easily. "Forget it," the second man said. "Not worth the trouble." They climbed back into their truck and drove away, leaving the parking lot empty except for the Honda and its unexpected protector. The dog watched until the taillights disappeared completely, then settled back against the car with a satisfied grunt. "He saved us," Sophie whispered, awe evident in her voice. Michael stared at the animal through the window, feeling something shift in his chest. For weeks, he'd seen the dog as another responsibility he couldn't afford, another mouth he couldn't feed. But tonight, the stray had proven himself to be something else entirely. "Yeah," Michael said softly, "he did." Sophie pressed her hand against the window where the dog's head rested on the other side. "Can we let him in? Just for tonight? It's so cold." Michael looked at his daughter's hopeful face, then at the dog who just stood guard over them. The Honda was already cramped with two people. Adding a dog would make it nearly impossible to sleep, but the temperature was dropping toward dangerous levels, and the animal had earned more than their gratitude. "Just for tonight," Michael said. He cracked the door open carefully, ready to shut it quickly if the dog showed any signs of aggression. Instead, the animal simply looked at him with intelligent brown eyes, waiting for permission. "Come on then," Michael said quietly. The dog slipped into the car with surprising grace, settling immediately onto the floor in front of Sophie's makeshift bed. His presence filled the small space with warmth and the not unpleasant smell of outdoors and adventure. Sophie reached down to stroke his matted fur, and the dog's tail gave a cautious wag. "What should we call him?" Michael watched the interaction, noting how gentle the animal was with his daughter, how careful. "I don't know, sweetheart. What do you think?" Sophie considered this seriously, studying the dog's scarred muzzle and wise eyes. "Rusty," she said finally. "Because he's the color of rust, but also because he's strong like metal that's been through stuff but doesn't break. Rusty it is." As they settled in for the night, the dog's steady breathing joining their own, Michael felt something he hadn't experienced in months, the simple comfort of not being alone. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new calculations of dollars and necessities. The Honda's engine had been making troubling sounds lately, coughing and hesitating in ways that promised expensive problems ahead. But tonight, they were 3 instead of 2, watchers instead of only watched, protected instead of only protecting. And in the morning, when the sun crept over the horizon and painted the frost-covered windshield gold, Michael would wake to find Rusty's eyes already open, alert and loyal, as if he'd been keeping vigil all night long. Some gifts, Michael was learning, came on 4 legs and asked for nothing more than the chance to belong. The Honda's death rattle started on a Tuesday morning, a grinding, metallic wheeze that spoke of expensive problems Michael couldn't afford to fix. He sat in the driver's seat outside Sophie's school, turning the key again and again, willing the engine to catch. On the 4th try, it sputtered to life with a sound like gravel in a blender. "Is she sick?" Sophie asked from the back seat, her hand resting protectively on Rusty's head. The dog had become her constant companion over the past week, accompanying them everywhere with the quiet dignity of someone who understood his place in their small family. "Just a little tired," Michael said, though the lie tasted bitter. He knew enough about engines to recognize the sound of a timing belt ready to snap, a water pump on its last legs, transmission fluid burning off in ways that meant thousands of dollars he didn't have. The drive to Claire's garage took twice as long as usual, Michael nursing the Honda through side streets at barely above idle speed. He'd avoided Claire Jennings' shop for months, not because he didn't trust her work. Everyone in town knew she was the best mechanic within 50 miles, but because he couldn't afford her honesty. Claire didn't sugarcoat problems or offer quick fixes that would fail in a week. She told the truth, and the truth was usually expensive. The garage sat on the edge of town, a converted barn painted white with red trim, its large doors open to reveal the organized chaos of a working shop. Claire emerged as they pulled in, wiping her hands on a rag, her steel-gray hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. She was somewhere in her 50s, tall and lean with the kind of competent presence that made people trust her with their most valuable possessions. "Michael Hayes," she said, her voice carrying a warmth that made his chest tighten. "Haven't seen you in a while." "Car's making some noise," he said, climbing out of the Honda. The understatement felt foolish the moment the words left his mouth. Claire tilted her head, listening to the engine's labored idle. "I can hear that from here. Pop the hood." Sophie and Rusty climbed out, the little girl immediately drawn to the various tools and equipment scattered around the garage. Rusty stayed close to her side, his tail wagging as he investigated the new smells of oil and metal in industry. "Well, aren't you a handsome fellow?" Claire said, crouching down to let Rusty sniff her hand. "Where'd you find this one?" "He found us," Sophie said proudly. "He protects us when we're sleeping." Claire's eyes flicked to Michael, a question forming in her expression, but she simply nodded. Good dogs have a way of knowing where they're needed. She spent the next 20 minutes examining the Honda's engine with the thoroughness of a surgeon, her hands moving with practiced efficiency among the belts and hoses and connections. Michael watched her face, reading the diagnosis in the way her eyebrows drew together, the soft grunt of concern when she checked the transmission fluid. "Well," she said finally, straightening up, "the good news is she's still running. The bad news is pretty much everything else." Michael's stomach dropped. "How bad?" "Timing belt's about to go, water pump's leaking, transmission's burning fluid, and you've got a brake line that's seen better days." Claire wiped her hands again, her expression gentle. "I'm talking about 1,500 in parts alone, maybe $2,000 with labor." The numbers hit Michael like physical blows. $2,000 might as well have been $2 million. He stared at the engine, calculating rapidly, and arriving at the same impossible conclusion over and over again. "I understand if you need to think about it," Claire said quietly, "but Michael, this car isn't safe to drive much longer, especially not with Sophie. How long do I have?" Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Maybe a week, if you're lucky. Maybe tomorrow if you're not. Michael closed his eyes, feeling the weight of impossible choices pressing down on him. Without the car, he couldn't get to work. Without work, he couldn't afford Sophie's medication. Without the medication... "I can do the brake line today," Claire said, interrupting his spiral of panic. "That's the most dangerous thing. Call it $50 for parts and labor." Michael opened his eyes. "$50 for brake work?" "I've got the parts lying around. Old inventory I need to move anyway." Another gentle lie, offered with the same grace Mrs. Patel had shown. "The rest can wait a few days while you figure things out." "Claire, I can't let you." "You're not letting me do anything," she said firmly. "I'm making a business decision. Better to get $50 now than nothing when your brakes fail and you can't pay at all." Sophie appeared at Michael's elbow, Rusty at her side. "Daddy, can Rusty and I explore while you talk to Miss Claire?" "Stay where I can see you," Michael said automatically. As Sophie wandered off with the dog, Claire lowered her voice. "Michael, I knew your wife. Sarah used to bring you lunch here when you were working on that old Mustang, remember? She'd sit right there on that workbench and tell me about her dreams for the flower shop she wanted to open." Michael's throat constricted. "I remember." "She was good people, and she'd be proud of how you're taking care of that little girl." Claire paused, studying his face. "But she'd also know when to ask for help." "I'm not asking." "You don't have to ask. Sometimes help just shows up whether we want it or not." Claire pulled a business card from her pocket and scribbled something on the back. "Jenna Morris over at the employment office called yesterday. Says the county's looking for part-time maintenance workers, flexible hours, decent pay. Might be worth a phone call." Michael took the card, reading the phone number written in Claire's careful handwriting. "Why are you doing this?" "Because Sarah once told me that kindness was like a river. It had to keep flowing or it would stagnate." Claire smiled, but her eyes remained serious. "Besides, I've got a feeling about you, Michael Hayes. I think your luck's about to change." As she worked on the brake line, humming softly to herself, Michael sat on an overturned crate and watched Sophie play with Rusty among the scattered tools and spare parts. The dog had found an old tennis ball somewhere and was gently tossing it for Sophie to catch, his tail wagging at her delighted laughter. When Claire finished, she handed him the keys with a smile. "That should hold you for a while. And Michael? When you're ready to tackle the bigger repairs, we'll figure something out. I could use some help around here on weekends if you're interested." Another door opening, another hand extended. Michael felt the familiar war between pride and gratitude, but this time gratitude won by a wider margin. "I'll think about it," he said. "You do that. And Michael, take care of yourself, all three of you." As they drove away, the Honda running smoother than it had in weeks, Michael caught Claire in his rearview mirror. She was already on the phone, her voice too distant to hear but her gestures animated. He had a feeling she wasn't talking about car repairs. In the back seat, Sophie was telling Rusty about all the interesting things she'd seen in the garage, her voice bright with the kind of happiness that came from feeling safe and cared for. And for the first time in months, Michael allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, Claire was right about his luck changing. Saturday morning brought the kind of cold that made the air itself seem brittle, as if the wrong word might shatter the silence hanging over the empty streets. Michael sat in the Honda outside Mabel's diner, counting the money in his wallet for the third time. $12.47. Enough for one meal if they shared it and skipped drinks and kept to the cheapest items on the menu. "Are we going to eat inside?" Sophie asked, her breath fogging the window as she pressed her face against the glass. It looked so warm. Through the diner's frost-edged windows, they could see the soft glow of overhead lights, the steam rising from coffee cups, the comfortable bustle of weekend morning regulars settling in for pancakes and gossip. It had been 3 weeks since they'd eaten anywhere but the car, surviving on peanut butter sandwiches and whatever day-old items Michael could afford from the grocery store's discount rack. "Just this once," Michael said, making the decision before he could think too hard about it. "It's too cold to eat in the car today." Sophie's face lit up with pure joy, and Rusty's tail began wagging as if he understood that something special was about to happen. Michael had fashioned a simple leash from rope, and the dog walked perfectly beside Sophie as they approached the diner's front door, his presence somehow lending dignity to their small procession. The warmth hit them like a wall as they stepped inside, carrying with it the rich scents of bacon and coffee and syrup. Michael's stomach cramped with sudden hunger, reminding him how little he'd eaten over the past few days. Most of their food went to Sophie, and what remained he often shared with Rusty when the dog's ribs became too visible beneath his improving coat. "Well, hello there!" Martha Lee's voice carried across the half-empty diner like a warm embrace. She'd been waiting tables at Mabel's for nearly 20 years, and she knew every regular by name and most by order. Her gray hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and her apron bore the battle scars of a busy morning service. "Hi, Miss Martha," Sophie said shyly, her hand finding Michael's as they stood uncertainly in the doorway. "And who's this handsome fellow?" Martha crouched down to Rusty's level, letting him sniff her outstretched hand. The dog's tail wagged cautiously, his natural wariness tempered by Sophie's obvious comfort with the woman. "This is Rusty," Sophie announced proudly. "He takes care of us." "I can see that. He's got kind eyes." Martha straightened, her gaze moving between Michael and Sophie with the practiced assessment of someone who'd spent decades reading people's stories in the way they held themselves, the clothes they wore, the careful way they counted change. "Why don't you folks take that booth by the window? I'll bring some coffee and hot chocolate." The vinyl seat of the booth was cracked but clean, and Sophie slid across it with the reverence of someone entering a palace. Rusty settled on the floor beside her, his chin resting on her feet in a gesture that had become his trademark sign of affection. Michael studied the menu, doing rapid calculations in his head. The cheapest breakfast was $4.95. 2 of those would leave him with less than $3, not enough for even a small tip. His pride warred with Sophie's obvious happiness as she pressed her hands against the warm window and watched the snow beginning to fall outside. "The pancakes here are famous," Martha said, appearing with a steaming mug of coffee for Michael and a paper cup of hot chocolate for Sophie. "Made from scratch every morning. And I might have accidentally made too many this morning. Hate to see them go to waste." She set a plate in front of Sophie before Michael could protest. 3 golden pancakes, perfectly round, with a pat of butter melting on top, and a small pitcher of syrup on the side. Sophie's eyes widened in wonder as if she'd been presented with treasure. "Miss Martha, we didn't order." "Like I said, extras. Can't serve them to other customers, health department rules." Martha's tone brooked no argument. "Besides, this little one looks like she could use some fattening up." Michael started to object again, but Sophie had already cut into the pancakes, her face glowing with happiness as she took the first bite. The sight of his daughter actually enjoying a real meal, hot and fresh, and served on real plates instead of eaten from paper bags in a cold car, made his throat close up with emotion. "He's, I'll have coffee," he said quietly. "Just coffee." "Nonsense. Can't have coffee without toast. 2 pieces, buttered, on the house. Consider it part of the coffee service." Before he could protest further, Martha was gone, bustling between tables with the efficiency of long practice. At the next booth over, an elderly man in a John Deere cap was reading a newspaper while his wife worked on a crossword puzzle. Normal people doing normal things on a normal Saturday morning. "Daddy, try this," Sophie said, offering him a forkful of pancake dripping with syrup. "It tastes like happiness." Michael accepted the bite, the sweetness flooding his mouth with flavors he'd almost forgotten. When had he last tasted real maple syrup? When had food been about pleasure instead of just survival? "It's perfect, sweetheart." Martha returned with his toast and a bowl of ice water for Rusty, setting it down without comment. As she refilled his coffee cup, she leaned slightly closer. "That little girl of yours has beautiful manners," she said quietly. "You're doing a good job with her." "Thank you," Michael managed. "Hard times don't last forever," Martha continued, her voice low enough that Sophie couldn't hear. "I've seen a lot of families come through here over the years. The ones who stick together, who keep loving each other through the rough patches, they always come out stronger." She moved away before he could respond, but her words lingered like the warmth of the coffee in his hands. Around them, the diner hummed with quiet conversation and the comfortable clatter of dishes, and for a moment Michael allowed himself to pretend they belonged here, that this was just a regular family enjoying breakfast together instead of a carefully calculated splurge. When they finished eating, Michael approached the register with his wallet in hand, steeling himself for the damage. Martha punched numbers into the old cash register, her fingers moving quickly over the keys. "That'll be $6 even," she said. Michael blinked. "I'm sorry, what?" $6. Coffee and toast for you, hot chocolate for the little one. The pancakes were extras, remember?" He handed her the money, knowing he should argue but unable to find the words. As he started to turn away, Martha caught his sleeve. "Hold on, honey. You forgot your change." She pressed something into his hand, closing his fingers around it before he could see what it was. Outside, under the gray sky with snow beginning to dust the sidewalks, Michael opened his hand. Along with his change, Martha had included a $20 bill and a handwritten note. "For Rusty's food. Dogs need to eat too. M." Sophie skipped beside him as they walked back to the car, her belly full and her cheeks pink with warmth and happiness. "That was the best breakfast ever," she declared. "Can we go back sometime?" "Maybe," Michael said, the word carrying more hope than it had in months. Behind them, through the diner's window, Martha watched them go while she talked quietly on the phone. Michael caught a glimpse of her in the side mirror, her expression serious and purposeful, and he wondered what stories she was telling. What quiet conspiracies of kindness were being set in motion by people who understood that sometimes help had to arrive disguised as accidents and extras and forgotten change. In the warmth of the Honda, with Sophie humming contentedly and Rusty's steady breathing filling the back seat, Michael felt something shift inside his chest. Not hope exactly, but something like it. Something that whispered that maybe, in a world that often felt cold and unforgiving, there were still people like Martha and Claire and Mrs. Patel, people who understood that kindness was a choice that multiplied itself in ways nobody could predict. Sunday morning service at Grace Community Church was a ritual Michael had abandoned months ago, not from any loss of faith but from the simple arithmetic of survival. Church clothes required dry cleaning he couldn't afford, and the thought of sitting in those familiar pews while his situation deteriorated felt like a special kind of torture. But Sophie had been asking about going back, and Reverend Caleb Moore had left 3 gentle voicemail messages over the past 2 weeks. So here they were, standing uncertainly in the parking lot while early arrivals climbed the steps to the white clapboard building that had anchored Main Street for over a century. Sophie wore her best dress, a blue cotton thing that was getting too small but still looked presentable, while Michael had managed to find a clean shirt and his one remaining tie. Rusty waited in the car, windows cracked for air, watching them through the glass with patient eyes. "I remember when Mama used to sing in the choir," Sophie said, taking Michael's hand as they approached the front steps. "She had the prettiest voice." "She did," Michael agreed, his chest tight with memory. Sarah had indeed sung alto in the church choir, her voice clear and strong during hymns, but soft and tender when she sang lullabies to baby Sophie, the same voice that had whispered encouragements during her final hospitalization, telling him he was going to be fine, that Sophie would be fine, that love would be enough to carry them through whatever came next. Love, it turned out, didn't pay for medication or car repairs or the thousand small necessities that kept a family afloat, but it did keep you moving forward one impossible day at a time. The sanctuary was half full. The familiar faces of longtime members mixed with visitors and families Michael recognized from Sophie's school. Mrs. Chen from the post office waved from the third pew. Bob Martinez, who ran the hardware store, nodded from across the aisle. Normal people living normal lives, their biggest concerns probably involving football scores and weekend plans. Reverend Caleb appeared as if summoned, his tall frame moving through the crowd with the easy grace of someone comfortable in his own skin. He was somewhere in his 50s, with graying hair and the kind of face that invited confidences. He'd officiated at Sarah's funeral, his words gentle but honest, acknowledging the injustice of losing someone so young while offering what comfort faith could provide. "Michael," Caleb said, his hand warm and solid on Michael's shoulder. "It's good to see you, both of you." "Reverend Moore," Sophie said formally, then broke into a smile. "I like your tie. It has little fish on it." Caleb looked down at his necktie, decorated with tiny silver fish. "These are supposed to remind us of the disciples who were fishermen, though I suspect they're really just there to make me smile." "They're working," Sophie said solemnly, making both men laugh. "Why don't you folks sit with me today?" Caleb suggested. "I've got a whole pew to myself up front. Gets lonely sometimes." They settled into the front pew, Sophie between the two men, her legs swinging freely since her feet didn't quite reach the floor. The service proceeded with familiar rhythms, opening hymns that Michael remembered from childhood, responsive readings that came back to him despite months of absence, the comfortable liturgy of a community gathering to acknowledge something larger than themselves. When Caleb rose to deliver his sermon, his text was from Matthew. "Consider the lilies of the field, how they grow, they toil not, neither do they spin. And yet I say unto you that even Solomon in all his glory was not arrayed like one of these." "It's easy to read these words as a command not to worry," Caleb began, his voice carrying easily through the small sanctuary. "But I think Jesus was really talking about something deeper. He was reminding us that there's a difference between providing for our families and carrying the weight of the whole world on our shoulders." Michael shifted uncomfortably, feeling as if the words were aimed directly at him. "Sometimes," Caleb continued, "we get so focused on being strong, on handling everything ourselves, that we forget we're part of something bigger. We forget that community isn't just about what we can give, it's about what we're willing to receive." After the service, as families clustered in the church hall for coffee and conversation, Caleb approached Michael with 2 steaming cups. "Walk with me." They stepped outside into the crisp afternoon air, leaving Sophie inside with Mrs. Chen, who was already regaling her with stories about the church's upcoming Christmas pageant. Rusty barked once from the car, but settled when he saw Michael through the window. "That's quite a dog you've got there," Caleb observed. "He's not really ours. Just sort of appeared. Sometimes the best things in life just appear." Caleb sipped his coffee, steam rising in the cold air. "I knew your wife well, Michael. Sarah used to volunteer in the church office, helped with the bulletin every week. We talked often." Michael tensed, unsure where this was leading. "She worried about you sometimes. Said you had a tendency to carry the whole world on your shoulders, even when there were people willing to help carry the load." "Sarah was a good woman," Michael said carefully. "She was, and she loved you and Sophie more than anything in this world." Caleb paused, studying Michael's profile. "She also told me once that if anything ever happened to her, she hoped you'd remember that asking for help isn't the same thing as giving up." They walked in silence for a moment, their footsteps crunching on the frost-covered sidewalk. Finally, Caleb spoke again. "I've been hearing things around town, Michael. Good things, mostly. Claire Jennings mentioned you might be looking for work. Martha Lee said you and Sophie stopped by the diner. Mrs. Patel says hello. Each name hit Michael like a small revelation. They were talking about him, these people who barely knew him, sharing information and concern as if he were family. "I'm managing fine," Michael said automatically. "I'm sure you are. You're a strong man, and Sophie's lucky to have you." Caleb stopped walking, turning to face him directly. "But strength isn't about doing everything alone, Michael. Sometimes the strongest thing we can do is let other people care about us. I don't want charity." "This isn't about charity. This is about community. About people who knew Sarah and remember what she meant to this town. About neighbors who see a good man working hard to take care of his daughter." Michael stared across the street at the park where he and Sarah used to bring baby Sophie to feed the ducks. The swings hung motionless in the still air, waiting for spring and children's laughter to bring them back to life. "I lost everything when she died," Michael said quietly. "The shop, the house, our savings, all of it went to medical bills that didn't even help in the end." "I know," Caleb said gently. "I signed the papers when you sold the house to pay for her treatment. Sophie deserves better than what I can give her. Sophie deserves a father who loves her enough to do whatever it takes to keep her safe and healthy, and from what I can see, that's exactly what she has." They stood in comfortable silence, watching a family across the street load children into a minivan, the ordinary chaos of Sunday afternoon routines. "There's a position opening up," Caleb said eventually. "Part-time maintenance work for the county. Flexible hours, decent pay, benefits after 6 months. I know someone on the hiring committee." Michael looked at him sharply. "I can't ask you to." "You're not asking. I'm offering. There's a difference." "Why?" Caleb smiled, the expression transforming his serious face. "Because Sarah once told me that kindness was like bread. It only mattered if you shared it while it was still warm." As they walked back toward the church, Michael felt something loosening in his chest, some knot of pride and fear that had been pulled so tight for so long he'd forgotten it was there. Through the church hall windows, he could see Sophie helping Mrs. Chen arrange flowers, her face bright with the kind of happiness that came from feeling useful and welcome. "Think about it," Caleb said as they reached the parking lot. "The job, I mean, but also think about letting people help. Not because you need charity, but because caring about each other is what makes us human." As they drove home, Sophie chattering about the Christmas pageant and Mrs. Chen's promise to teach her how to arrange flowers, Michael found himself thinking about bread and warmth, and the way kindness could multiply itself when it was shared freely. In the rearview mirror, he caught sight of Caleb standing on the church steps, talking animatedly on his cell phone, his free hand gesturing in the enthusiastic way of someone setting plans in motion. For the first time in months, Michael allowed himself to wonder what those plans might be, and whether he was strong enough to let them unfold. The collapse came on a Wednesday, sudden and complete, like a building that had been weakening for months, finally surrendering to gravity. Michael had been working 3 jobs that week: morning shifts at the county maintenance yard that Reverend Caleb had helped him secure, afternoon hours helping Claire at the garage, and late-night cleaning at the office complex on the outskirts of town. He'd managed perhaps 10 hours of sleep over the past 3 days, subsisting on coffee and the granola bars Sophie insisted he take from their dwindling food supply. The irony wasn't lost on him that he collapsed outside the very place that had become their lifeline. Mrs. Patel's pharmacy glowed warm and inviting in the early evening darkness as Michael pulled into the parking lot. Sophie buckled safely in the back seat, with Rusty's protective bulk beside her. They were there for her evening dose of medication, the routine that had kept her stable for weeks now. "Daddy, you look really tired," Sophie said as he turned off the engine. The Honda's recent repairs had held, but the heater was struggling against the bitter February cold that had settled over the town like a punishment. "Just a long day, sweetheart." Michael's voice sounded hollow even to himself. When he stepped out of the car, the world tilted sideways for a moment, black spots dancing at the edges of his vision. He gripped the door handle, breathing deeply of the frigid air until his equilibrium returned. Inside the pharmacy, Mrs. Patel looked up from her computer with the warm smile that had become as essential to their routine as the medication itself. But her expression shifted to concern as she took in Michael's appearance, the gray pallor of his skin, the way he swayed slightly on his feet, the tremor in his hands as he reached for his wallet. "Mr. Hayes, are you feeling all right?" "Fine," he said automatically, though the words seemed to come from very far away. "Just needs Sophie's prescription." Sophie had wandered over to the small display of greeting cards, Rusty at her side, but she kept glancing back at her father with the intuitive worry that children develop when they're forced to become caretakers too young. She'd been watching him more carefully lately, Michael realized, noting the way he forgot to eat, the way he sometimes stared at nothing for long minutes at a time. Mrs. Patel moved with practiced efficiency, but Michael could feel her eyes on him as she prepared the medication. The pharmacy felt too warm after the bitter cold outside. Or maybe he was just dizzy. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like angry insects, and the antiseptic smell that usually comforted him now made his stomach churn. "That'll be $15, Mrs. Patel said gently. Another of her mysterious insurance adjustments that Michael had stopped questioning, grateful beyond words for her quiet generosity. He reached for his wallet, and that's when the world went sideways completely. The black spots expanded, swallowing his vision, and he felt his knees buckle as consciousness slipped away like water through his fingers. He came to on the floor behind the pharmacy counter, Mrs. Patel's concerned face hovering above him while Sophie knelt beside his head, her small hands stroking his hair with the same gentle touch her mother had once used when he was sick. "Don't try to sit up yet," Mrs. Patel said firmly. "You fainted. When did you last eat something substantial?" Michael tried to remember. Yesterday morning? The day before? Time had become elastic lately, stretching and contracting in ways that made it hard to track the basic necessities of survival. "I'm fine," he said weakly, though the words carried no conviction. "Daddy? You scared me," Sophie whispered, her voice thick with tears she was trying not to shed. "You just fell down." Rusty had somehow gotten behind the counter and now sat pressed against Sophie's side, his warm bulk offering comfort in the way that only dogs seem to understand instinctively. His brown eyes were fixed on Michael with an expression of such concern that it might have been funny under different circumstances. Mrs. Patel helped him sit up slowly, her nurse's training evident in the way she monitored his color and breathing. "Mr. Hayes, I'm going to speak plainly because I care about you and Sophie. You're running yourself into the ground. Your body is telling you to stop." "I can't stop," Michael said, the truth spilling out in his weakened state. "If I stop working, even for a day, we lose everything. Sophie needs her medication, and the car payment is due, and none of that matters if you collapse and can't work at all," Mrs. Patel interrupted gently but firmly. "When did you become the only person responsible for everything?" The question hit him like a physical blow. When had he decided that accepting help was the same as failing? When had he convinced himself that suffering in silence was somehow noble? "Sophie needs me to be strong," he said quietly. "Sophie needs you to be alive and healthy," Mrs. Patel corrected. "She needs you to take care of yourself so you can take care of her." Through the pharmacy's front window, Michael could see people beginning to gather on the sidewalk. Word traveled fast in a small town, and someone had seen the ambulance that Mrs. Patel had called, despite his protests. Reverend Caleb appeared first, his tall frame unmistakable even in the dim light. Then Claire, still in her work coveralls, her face creased with worry. Martha from the diner, carrying what looked like a thermos of soup. "Mrs. Patel," Sophie said in a small voice, "is my daddy going to be okay?" "Your daddy is going to be fine, sweetheart. But he needs to learn something important about letting people help him." Michael watched through the window as his unlikely support network gathered, their faces filled with genuine concern. These people barely knew him, yet here they were, dropping their evening plans to check on a man who'd been too proud to admit he was drowning. The EMTs arrived and insisted on checking his vitals, pronouncing him exhausted but stable. As they packed up their equipment, Reverend Caleb stepped inside, his presence somehow making the small pharmacy feel less overwhelming. "Michael," he said simply, "we need to talk. I know what you're going to say." "Do you?" "Because I was going to say that watching someone you care about destroy himself trying to be a hero isn't actually very heroic at all." The words stung because they carried the weight of truth. Michael looked at Sophie, who was trying so hard to be brave, and at Mrs. Patel, who had shown them nothing but kindness, and at the faces gathered outside the window, people who cared enough to show up in the cold simply because they'd heard he might need help. "I don't know how to stop," he admitted finally. "You don't have to stop," Caleb said gently. "You just have to learn that you're not alone, that this community wants to help, not because you're weak, but because you're family." As they helped him to his feet, Sophie slipped her hand into his. "Daddy," she said quietly, "remember when Rusty was all alone and hungry, and we helped him? Maybe it's okay for people to help us, too." Out of the mouths of babes. Michael squeezed her hand, feeling something shift in his chest. Not the loosening of pride he'd experienced before, but its transformation into something else. Something that might, eventually, become wisdom. Through the window, he could see Martha setting up what looked like an impromptu food station on the sidewalk, while Claire talked animatedly on her phone. The machinery of small-town care was already in motion, and for the first time since Sarah's death, Michael didn't feel the need to run from it. The conspiracy of kindness began before dawn on Thursday morning, while Michael slept deeply for the first time in weeks on Reverend Caleb's couch. Sophie had been settled in the guest room with Rusty curled protectively at the foot of her bed, both of them surrounded by more warmth and comfort than they'd experienced in months. But across town, phones were ringing and quiet plans were being set into motion. Mrs. Patel arrived at her pharmacy an hour early, not to open for business but to make a series of carefully considered phone calls. Her first was to Dr. Richards at the county health clinic, a conversation that resulted in a new payment plan for Sophie's care that somehow involved mysteriously generous insurance coverage. Her second call was to the pharmaceutical company, a discussion about patient assistance programs that would ensure uninterrupted access to medication regardless of financial circumstances. At the garage, Claire was already 3 hours into what should have been Michael's workday, handling the maintenance tasks he'd been covering while making her own calls. The first was to Jerry Thompson at the county offices, the man who'd hired Michael for part-time work that was about to become full-time with benefits. The second was to her bank, arranging to pay off the remaining balance on the Honda's repairs from an account she'd been saving for her own retirement. "But he can't know it came from me," she told Jerry over coffee that tasted like motor oil but kept them both warm in the early morning cold. "Man's got pride, and that's not a bad thing. But pride and stubbornness aren't the same, and right now he needs to learn the difference." Martha had opened Mabel's diner at 5 a.m. as usual, but instead of her normal prep routine, she was coordinating what she called the most important breakfast service of the year. She'd called every regular customer she could think of, explaining the situation with the simple directness that made her such an effective waitress. Good man, raising his daughter alone, working himself sick, trying to make ends meet. Time for this town to show what it's made of. By 8 a.m., the diner was fuller than it had been since the county fair, but instead of ordering their usual coffee and eggs, customers were contributing to what Martha had dubbed the Hayes Family Community Fund. Bob Martinez from the hardware store contributed the cost of a week's worth of groceries. The Chen family from the post office added enough for a month of gas. Even teenagers from the high school showed up with crumpled dollar bills and pocket change, money they'd normally spend on sodas and candy. "It's not charity," Martha explained to each contributor, using the phrase that had become the morning's mantra. "It's community. It's what we do when someone's been carrying more than their share and needs to remember they're not alone." At Grace Community Church, Reverend Caleb was having his own conversations, both with his congregation and with his conscience. The small church had a discretionary fund, designed exactly for situations like this, but more importantly, it had a network of people who understood that faith without action was just wishful thinking. Mrs. Chen volunteered to coordinate meals, not the institutional casseroles that screamed charity case, but the kind of abundant cooking that happened when someone's neighbor just happened to make too much chili and needed someone to help them eat it. Bob Martinez offered to handle any household repairs that might be needed, framing it as a way to keep his skills sharp during the slow winter months. The genius of their approach was its invisibility, no grand gestures, no public announcements, no ceremonies that would make Michael feel like an object of pity. Instead, it was a web of small kindnesses designed to look like coincidences, the kind of fortunate accidents that might happen to anyone in a community that cared about its members. When Michael woke that afternoon, groggy but more rested than he'd been in months, he found Sophie in the church kitchen with Mrs. Chen, learning to fold dumplings while Rusty supervised from his position beneath the table. The scene was so domestic, so normal, that it made his chest ache with longing for the kind of life he'd almost forgotten was possible. "Daddy?" Sophie looked up from her dumpling folding with flour on her nose and joy in her eyes. "Mrs. Chen is teaching me to make wontons. She says Mama used to help her with the church potlucks when I was little." She did indeed, Mrs. Chen confirmed, her hands moving with practiced efficiency as she demonstrated the proper folding technique. Sarah had excellent hands for dumpling work. Very gentle, very precise. It was the first time in months that someone had mentioned Sarah without Michael feeling like he was being pitied for his loss. Instead, Mrs. Chen spoke of his wife as if she were still part of the community's living memory, still contributing to its life and the skills she'd passed on to her daughter. Reverend Caleb appeared in the kitchen doorway, his sleeves rolled up and his collar askew in a way that suggested he'd been wrestling with more than just theological questions. "Michael, feeling better?" "Yes, thank you. I should get out of your way." "Actually, I was hoping you might stay for dinner. Mrs. Chen has made enough food for a small army, and Sophie's been telling everyone about Rusty's food preferences." As if summoned by his name, Rusty emerged from beneath the table, his tail wagging hopefully. Over the past few weeks, he'd grown sleek and healthy on regular meals and affection, transforming from a cautious stray into a dog who clearly knew he belonged somewhere. Dinner was a revelation, not because the food was extraordinary, though Mrs. Chen's dumplings were indeed perfect, but because of the easy way conversation flowed around the table. Sophie chattered about her day at school, where her teacher had apparently started a classroom project about community helpers that seemed suspiciously timed to her situation. Caleb shared stories about the church's upcoming outreach programs, several of which seemed to require exactly the kind of maintenance skills Michael possessed. It wasn't until later, when Sophie was asleep and he was helping clean up, that Michael began to understand the scope of what was happening around him. Funny thing, Caleb mentioned casually as they loaded the dishwasher. "Claire called earlier, says your car passed its inspection with flying colors. All the major repairs completed, fully paid up. Apparently there was some kind of warranty program she'd forgotten about." Michael paused, a plate halfway to the dishwasher rack. "Warranty program?" "That's what she said. Also mentioned that Jerry Thompson wants to talk to you tomorrow about expanding your hours at the county. Benefits package, the whole thing." The pieces clicked together slowly, like a puzzle Michael had been too exhausted to solve. The coincidences were too convenient, the timing too perfect. His collapse outside the pharmacy hadn't just been a moment of weakness. It had been a catalyst, the final evidence his reluctant guardians needed to move from individual acts of kindness to coordinated action. "How many people are involved in this?" he asked quietly. Caleb smiled, his expression holding equal parts mischief and compassion. "Involved in what?" "Sometimes good things just happen, Michael. Sometimes the community decides that someone has been carrying too much alone for too long." Through the kitchen window, Michael could see lights coming on in houses across the neighborhood, normal families settling in for normal evenings, secure in the knowledge that they belonged somewhere, that they mattered to someone beyond themselves. For the first time since Sarah's death, Michael allowed himself to believe that he and Sophie might belong somewhere too. Not as objects of pity, but as members of a community that had decided they were worth protecting, worth investing in, worth keeping. The realization should have felt overwhelming, but instead it felt like coming home. The community room at Grace Community Church had never felt smaller than it did on this particular Sunday evening, filled as it was with faces that had become both familiar and precious to Michael over the past few weeks. Folding chairs arranged in an imperfect circle, coffee growing cold in styrofoam cups, the warm glow of overhead lights casting gentle shadows on people who had gathered not for a meeting or a program, but simply because Reverend Caleb had asked them to come. Michael sat between Sophie and Reverend Caleb, his hands clasped tightly in his lap, trying to find the words for something he'd never done before, telling the truth about his life to people who might actually listen without judgment. Rusty lay at Sophie's feet, his presence somehow lending courage to the whole endeavor. "I'm not good at this," Michael began, his voice barely above a whisper in the quiet room. "Talking, I mean. Sarah was always the one who could talk to people." Mrs. Patel smiled encouragingly from across the circle. "Just start wherever feels right, dear." Michael looked around the room at the faces gathered there. Claire with her honest eyes and oil-stained hands, Martha still wearing her diner apron after a long shift, Mrs. Chen with her gentle wisdom, Bob Martinez looking uncomfortable but determined to be there. These people had seen him at his lowest point and had chosen to help anyway. "I guess it started when Sarah got sick," he said, finding his voice growing stronger as he spoke. "We had insurance, but it didn't cover everything. Experimental treatments, medications that weren't approved yet, travel to specialists. It all added up so fast. Sophie reached over and took his hand, her small fingers warm against his palm. "Tell them about the shop, Daddy." "I had a repair shop. Nothing fancy, but it was ours. Sarah and I. We built it from nothing, one customer at a time." Michael's voice carried a note of pride that had been absent for so long he'd forgotten what it felt like. "But when the medical bills started coming, we mortgaged everything. The shop, the house, our future." He paused, remembering those last desperate months when every decision had been about buying time, about finding one more treatment that might save the woman who was the center of his world. In the end, it wasn't enough. We lost her anyway, and I lost everything else trying to save her. The shop went to pay the hospital bills. The house went to pay for the treatments that didn't work. By the time she died, all I had left was Sophie and a car that barely ran. Claire shifted in her chair, and Michael caught the expression on her face. Not pity, but understanding. These were people who knew about loss, about the ways life could change direction without warning. "I thought I could handle it," Michael continued. "I thought if I just worked hard enough, if I just sacrificed enough, I could give Sophie the life she deserved. But I was so focused on not being a burden that I forgot what Sarah always told me about community." "What did she tell you?" Reverend Caleb asked gently. "That we're not meant to carry everything alone, that asking for help isn't the same as giving up." Michael's voice broke slightly on the words. "She used to say that kindness was like a river. It had to keep flowing or it would dry up." Mrs. Chen nodded knowingly. "Your Sarah was a wise woman." "She was. And she would have known how to accept what all of you have given us. She wouldn't have been too proud to let people care about her." Sophie squeezed his hand. "She would have been proud of you too, Daddy, for working so hard to take care of me." "I haven't been taking care of you, sweetheart. I've been barely keeping us alive." "There's a difference." Martha leaned forward in her chair. "Michael, honey, do you know what I see when I look at you? I see a man who gave up everything to save his wife, and when that wasn't possible, who gave up everything again to save his daughter. That's not barely surviving. That's love in action." "But I was sleeping in my car," Michael protested, "letting my 8-year-old daughter think we were camping when really I couldn't afford rent." "What kind of father does that?" "The kind who makes impossible choices look easy because he loves his child more than his own comfort," Claire said firmly. "The kind who works 3 jobs and forgets to eat because every dollar goes to keeping his daughter healthy and safe." Bob Martinez, who had been silent until now, cleared his throat. "My daddy lost his job during the recession when I was about Sophie's age. We lived in our car for 6 months while he looked for work. You know what I remember about that time? Not the hardship. I remember how safe I felt because my daddy was there, taking care of everything. That's what Sophie's going to remember too." Michael looked at his daughter, trying to see their situation through her eyes. Sophie was watching him with an expression of such fierce love and pride that it took his breath away. "You know what I told Mrs. Chen yesterday?" Sophie said, her voice clear and confident in the quiet room. "I told her that my daddy is the bravest person I know. Because even when everything was scary and hard, he never stopped taking care of me. And he never stopped believing things would get better. Even when I wanted to give up? Especially then. That's what makes you brave, Daddy. Not that you weren't scared, but that you kept going anyway." The room fell silent for a moment, the weight of a child's wisdom settling over the adults who had gathered to help but had ended up learning something themselves. "I don't know how to thank all of you," Michael said finally. "Not just for the practical things, the job, the car repairs, the food, the medication help, but for seeing us as people worth caring about when I'd forgotten that myself." "That's what community means," Reverend Caleb said quietly. "It means nobody carries the load alone. It means when someone stumbles, the rest of us help them find their footing again. But how do I pay it back? How do I—" "You don't pay it back," Mrs. Patel interrupted gently. "You pay it forward. Someday, when you're steady on your feet again, you'll see someone else who needs a hand up. And you'll remember what it felt like to be helped. And you'll know what to do." As the evening wound down and people began gathering their coats and saying their goodbyes, Michael felt something he hadn't experienced since before Sarah's illness. The sense of belonging somewhere, of being part of something larger than his own struggle. Walking home with Sophie and Rusty through the quiet streets, he could see lights in windows, families settling in for normal Sunday evenings in houses they owned, with jobs they could count on and futures they could plan for. For the first time in over a year, Michael could imagine that life for himself and Sophie, not as an impossible dream, but as something they might actually build together, with the help of people who had chosen to care about them. "Daddy," Sophie said as they climbed the front steps of the small apartment Reverend Caleb had helped them find, "do you think Mama knows about all the people who helped us?" Michael looked up at the star-filled sky, remembering another night when Sophie had talked about promises hidden in the darkness. "I think she knows, sweetheart, and I think she's proud of how brave you've been through all of this." "I think she's proud of you too," Sophie said matter-of-factly, "for finally letting people love us." As they settled into their first real home in months, Rusty claiming his spot at the foot of Sophie's bed with the satisfaction of a dog who knew he belonged, Michael marveled at the strange alchemy that had transformed his greatest moment of weakness into the foundation for something stronger than he'd ever been able to build alone. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new responsibilities, new opportunities to prove himself worthy of the investment this community had made in him and Sophie. But tonight, surrounded by the quiet sounds of a family at peace, he allowed himself to believe that they were finally, truly home. Spring arrived late that year, but when it finally came, it transformed the world with the sudden generosity of someone making up for lost time. Michael stood in the small backyard behind their apartment, watching Sophie and Rusty explore the patch of earth that Reverend Caleb had optimistically called a garden space, when he'd helped them find the place 3 months ago. "Daddy, look!" Sophie held up a packet of sunflower seeds, her face bright with possibility. "Mrs. Chen says these will grow taller than me by summer." Michael smiled, remembering when such promises had seemed impossible, when the future had stretched ahead like an endless winter with no hope of thaw. Now, with steady work at the county and weekend shifts at Claire's garage, he could actually plan beyond the next prescription, the next meal, the next crisis. The Honda sat in the narrow driveway, reliable now thanks to Claire's expertise and the community's quiet generosity. Michael had finally stopped trying to calculate the exact cost of their kindness, accepting instead that some debts were meant to be paid forward rather than backward. "Plant them wherever you think they'll be happiest," he told Sophie, settling onto the wooden steps that led to their small back porch. Rusty had already claimed his favorite spot in a patch of morning sunlight, his coat glossy and his eyes bright with the contentment of a dog who knew exactly where he belonged. Mrs. Patel appeared at the back gate, carrying a small bag that Michael recognized as containing Sophie's medication. Over the past month, she'd taken to making house calls, claiming it was more convenient for her schedule, though Michael suspected it was really because she enjoyed seeing them settled and thriving. "How's our girl doing?" she asked, settling beside Michael on the steps. "Better every day. The new apartment is good for her, warm, stable. She's sleeping through the night again." "And her father?" Michael considered the question seriously, learning, slowly, but learning. Through the kitchen window, he could see the collection of casserole dishes that had appeared throughout the week: Martha's famous chili, Mrs. Chen's dumplings, Bob Martinez's wife's enchiladas. Not charity, but the natural abundance of a community that had decided they were family. "Mr. Hayes called yesterday," Mrs. Patel said casually. "From the insurance company, said there might be additional coverage for Sophie's care, retroactive adjustments, something about policy reviews." Michael looked at her sharply, recognizing another of the mysterious coincidences that had been reshaping their lives. "Mrs. Patel, sometimes good things just happen, dear. Best not to question them too closely." Sophie came running over, dirt on her knees and joy in her eyes. "Daddy, Rusty found a perfect spot for the sunflowers, right where they'll get morning sun and afternoon shade." "Sounds like Rusty knows about gardens," Mrs. Patel observed. "He knows about everything," Sophie said, with the absolute certainty of a child who had found her place in the world. "He knew we needed him, and he knew other people would help us, and he knew we were going to be okay." That evening, as Michael tucked Sophie into her own bed in her own room, she reached up and touched his cheek with the gentle gesture that always reminded him of her mother. "Daddy, are you happy now?" Michael looked around the small bedroom with its second-hand furniture and hand-me-down books, at Rusty curled protectively at the foot of the bed, at his daughter's face glowing with security and love. 6 months ago, he would have measured happiness in terms of what they lacked. Now he understood it was about what they had found, not just stability and shelter, but belonging. "Yes, sweetheart, I'm happy now." "Good, Mama would be happy too." Outside their window, the last light of day painted the sky in shades of promise, and somewhere in the distance, Michael could hear the sound of neighbors calling their children in for dinner, the ordinary music of community life that he had learned to treasure above all else. They were home. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.